All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow,
Yeah.
specifically Chapter 6. This book, really makes you think about mass incarceration in the U.S. and,
Yeah.
you know, I think it's going to give us all a whole new perspective on race and the justice system.
Yeah. I think one of the things that Alexander does so well is she challenges this assumption that the U.S. prison system is really effective just because we see, relatively low crime rates, but also record high incarceration numbers.
Yeah, that's something that I feel like I've always kind of taken for granted. Like, less crime, more people in prison. It seems like a pretty straightforward equation, right? But Alexander really makes you question that.
She does, yeah. She points to all this research that shows, the standard estimates, they only attribute like 3 to 25% of crime reduction to mass incarceration. And, get this, some scholars even argue that mass incarceration can actually increase crime.
Wait, hold on. How does that work?
Yeah.
How could putting more people behind bars lead to more crime?
Well, it's about the impact on communities, families. When you have a large portion of the population, especially young men, cycling in and out of prison, it really disrupts the whole social structure, and it creates this cycle of poverty and unemployment. And unfortunately, those factors can contribute to more crime.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So if mass incarceration isn't really about reducing crime, then what is it about?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And Alexander argues that the system, it is effective, but not in the way that it claims to be. It's really effective as a tool of social control, specifically racial control. She even uses the term fantastic success to describe how the system achieves this.
Wow. That's a pretty chilling thought. It makes you wonder why we're so hesitant to talk about race when we talk about reforming the justice system.
Yeah, it's interesting. Alexander, she talks about this idea of colorblind advocacy, this idea that we can address the problems of mass incarceration without actually ever mentioning race.
Yeah. I can see how that would be appealing to some people. It seems less divisive. Maybe it would be easier to get bipartisan support that way. And, we're in a time right now where states are having to rethink harsh sentencing because of budget constraints. And, with crime rates declining, it seems like there are more conversations happening about drug policy reform. So it seems like a good time to kind of push for change without getting bogged down in this whole race debate, right?
Yeah, there's definitely that temptation. And, there have been some positive steps, like California's Proposition 36, which eased their 3 strikes law. And then, you have things like marijuana decriminalization in Massachusetts.
Yeah, those feel like steps in the right direction for sure. So why is Alexander kind of urging us to resist this seemingly easier path of colorblind advocacy?
Well, because she argues that it won't actually address the underlying problem, which is, these really deeply embedded racial dynamics and stereotypes that are fueling the system. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. You might feel a little bit better temporarily, but the problem is still there.
Yeah. So it's not just about avoiding the optics of talking about race. It's about actually getting to the root of the problem, which is so intertwined with race.
Yeah, exactly. By not talking about race, it allows the system to keep operating under this veil of deniability, to pretend that it's not about race, when all the evidence suggests that it is.
So colorblindness, while it seems well-intentioned, could actually be kind of preventing real progress. It's like we're just sweeping the real issue under the rug.
Exactly. It creates this illusion of progress, this feeling that things are getting better because we're not talking about race. But, under the surface, all these racial disparities persist. And in some cases, they're even getting worse.
It's like we're patting ourselves on the back for being colorblind. But the system is still targeting and harming communities of color.
Yeah, and that's one of the dangers that Alexander points out, this colorblind approach. It reinforces that harmful myth that anyone can succeed if they just work hard enough. It ignores all of these systemic barriers that people of color are facing, barriers that have been built into our institutions for generations.
Right. It's that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that completely ignores the fact that some people are starting this race miles behind everyone else.
Exactly. It's not a level playing field, and pretending it is just allows the game to continue, rigged in favor of those who already hold the power.
It's like saying, sure, you can join the game, but we're going to tie your shoelaces together first.
Haha, that's a great analogy. It really highlights how this approach can actually make the problem worse.
And then Alexander uses this term that I found really interesting. She talks about this idea of a racial bribe, which is a very strong term, but she uses it to describe how even well-intentioned policies, like affirmative action, can sometimes actually function in a way that prevents systemic change.
Yeah, she argues that affirmative action, While it's intended to create opportunities for people of color, it can also end up being a way to sort of appease a small group of people without actually addressing the larger system of inequality.
So instead of focusing on dismantling the systems that are creating these disparities, we're just focused on getting a few people through the cracks.
Yeah, it creates this illusion of progress, the sense that we're making strides towards racial equality, but it can divert attention and resources away from more radical systemic change.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It might stop the bleeding for a minute, but it doesn't actually heal the injury.
Exactly. Alexander's arguing that this focus on individual achievement, this focus on exceptionalism, it can actually distract us from the need for a complete restructuring of society.
So instead of focusing on getting a few people of color into positions of power, we should be looking at how to change the systems that are keeping so many people of color from even having a chance in the first place.
That's the heart of her argument. And it's challenging because it requires us to move beyond these surface-level solutions and to actually confront these deeper, more systemic issues.
So while colorblindness might seem like the easier or more comfortable approach, Alexander's arguing that it's actually harmful to achieving real change.
Absolutely.
It's a perspective that definitely makes you think. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are already forming their own opinions on this. But before we go any further with colorblindness, I kind of want to shift gears for a second and talk about a specific example that Alexander brings up, this idea of the Obama paradox.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting because she looks at the challenges and the opportunities that were presented by Barack Obama's presidency. On the one hand, you have Obama's personal experience with drug use and his awareness of its potential consequences, which might lead you to think that he would be sympathetic to people who are caught up in the system.
Right. But then you have these other aspects of his stance on criminal justice that seem to contradict that. He appointed some pretty well-known drug warriors to important positions in his administration. He supported the death penalty, even in cases that the Supreme Court said were unconstitutional.
Yeah. And he even had plans to bring back these failed drug war programs, like the COP-PS program and burn grants. So Alexander asks this really tough question. Did Obama's presidency actually make it harder to fight against mass incarceration?
That's a really hard question to answer. Because on the one hand, you have the historic significance of having a black president, which, for a lot of people represented progress and hope.
Right, and that symbolism can be really powerful. But Alexander cautions us to look beyond the symbolism and to really examine the actual policies and their impact.
So while electing a black president might have looked like progress, the underlying systems of oppression were still there.
Exactly, and she points out how this situation created a tough dilemma for black communities. On the one hand, they might not want to criticize a black president, even on issues that are really important to them.
And then on the other hand, people in power could use Obama's success to say, see, racism is over, which would make it even harder to talk about systemic racism.
Yeah, the argument becomes, if a black man can be president, then racism must be over, right? But that completely ignores the reality that systemic racism is still affecting people of color every day.
So it's like a double-edged sword, where the symbolism of Obama's presidency could actually make it harder to fight for racial justice.
Exactly. That's the paradox. It's a reminder that real progress requires more than just representation. It requires a fundamental change in the system.
In our policies.
And in our way of thinking.
Our collective consciousness.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so interesting about Alexander's work. She doesn't just, point out the problem. She actually talks about some potential solutions. Like, she highlights this organization called All of Us or None. It's a grassroots organization that's led by formerly incarcerated people.
That sounds like they would have a really unique perspective on this. What are they pushing for specifically?
Well, they're advocating for like a much more inclusive and radical approach to racial justice. They say we need to move beyond these. They call them trickle-down solutions and cosmetic diversity.
Okay. Could you break those down a little bit for our listeners who might not be familiar with those terms?
Yeah, sure. So trickle-down solutions, those are policies that focus on helping a small number of people at the top with the hope that those benefits will eventually, trickle down to everyone else, like focusing on increasing the number of black CEOs or politicians with the hope that that will somehow improve the lives of all black people.
I see. And then cosmetic diversity.
Cosmetic diversity is about creating the appearance of inclusion without actually changing the systems that are creating inequality, like having a diverse group of people in a boardroom, but they all still have the same very limited amount of power.
Got it. So all of us or none is saying we need to do more than just, like,
Mm.
increase representation or focus on a few success stories. It's about completely restructuring society.
Exactly. They're arguing that true racial justice can't just be about a few people getting ahead. It's got to be about dismantling the systems that create inequality in the first place.
It's about solidarity, not just representation.
Yeah, exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all connected and that real progress requires a collective effort.
So Alexander talks a lot about the importance of building a multiracial coalition for social and economic justice. Why is that so important in her view?
Well, she argues that real change, it can't just be about people of color fighting for their own liberation. It has to be a broad coalition of people from all different backgrounds who recognize that they all have a stake in dismantling these systems.
So it's about recognizing that these issues impact everyone, even if it's not in the same way, and that we all need to work together to make progress.
Exactly. She talks specifically about the importance of including poor and working-class white people in this coalition, recognizing that they're also harmed by these systems.
It makes sense. If we're talking
Yeah.
about restructuring society, it needs to be a collective effort. You can't rebuild something if only half the people are involved.
That's a great point. And that's something that all of us, or none, really emphasizes. They're not just fighting for the rights of formerly incarcerated people, they're fighting for a more just society for everyone.
This is powerful stuff. To kind of bring home the urgency of Alexander's message, I want to bring in the words of another really important voice. James Baldwin, his book, The Fire Next Time, speaks so powerfully about the impact of racial injustice in America.
Yeah, Baldwin's work is so essential to this conversation, and Alexander actually quotes a line from The Fire Next Time that I think really captures the heart of her argument.
I think I know the one you're talking about. This is the crime of which I accuse my country and my countrymen, and for which neither I, nor time, nor history will ever forgive them, that they have destroyed and are destroying hundreds of thousands of lives and do not know it and do not want to know it.
Exactly. It's such a stark reminder of the human cost of these systems of oppression. And Alexander uses Baldwin's words to really emphasize the urgency of this moment, the need to act now before more lives are destroyed.
There's this real sense of moral imperative in those words, right? It's not just about changing laws. It's about a much deeper shift in our consciousness.
Absolutely.
And recognizing the humanity of all people
Yeah.
and refusing to be complicit in their dehumanization.
You've hit the nail on the head. Alexander, building on Baldwin's ideas, reminds us that we can't be truly free until everyone is free.
Our liberation is bound up with one another's.
Exactly.
And this brings us back to Alexander's critique of colorblindness. It's not just some theoretical debate. It has real consequences for how we approach social change.
Yeah. She's saying that striving for a colorblind society might actually be part of the problem because it allows us to ignore the reality that race still has such a huge impact on our lives.
So instead of pretending we don't see race, we should be trying to see each other fully, recognizing our differences, but also our shared humanity.
That's exactly it. It's about moving beyond the simplistic idea of colorblindness and embracing a more nuanced and compassionate understanding of race.
One that allows us to see the injustices
Yeah.
and then work to change them.
Right. It's not about erasing our differences. It's about understanding how those differences have been used to create and maintain these systems of power and oppression.
It's about recognizing that pretending we don't see race doesn't make racism go away.
Exactly. It just allows it to operate in more subtle and insidious ways.
And this goes beyond just how we interact with each other, right?
Right.
It's about how these racial dynamics are baked into our institution.
Our laws, our policies,
Everything.
everything.
It's about having those uncomfortable conversations, challenging our own biases,
Absolutely.
and working to dismantle these systems.
Right. And that brings us back to this idea of the racial bribe.
Yeah.
Alexander uses that term to show how certain policies, even if they seem beneficial, can actually slow down real progress.
Can you give us an example of that, how that racial bribe might play out in the real world?
Sure, think about all this focus on diversity in corporate leadership,
Okay.
having more Black people in CEO positions. While representation is important, Alexander argues that just adding a few people of color to the top doesn't address the deeper issues that are preventing most people of color from even getting a foot in the door.
It's like giving a few people access to the executive suite,
Yeah.
but the elevator's broken for everyone else.
Exactly. It's this focus on individual achievement and exceptionalism
Yeah.
that can distract us from the need for systemic change.
It makes it look like we're making progress, but the reality is very different.
Yeah, and she asks us to think about Who benefits from this illusion of progress?
Who is included in this us that's supposedly benefiting from these small gains?
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, are we just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic? Or are we actually trying to build a better ship for everyone?
That's the question she's asking. Are we satisfied with these symbolic victories? Or are we really committed to dismantling these systems and building something new?
It's a question that requires us to be honest with ourselves
Yeah.
about how we've benefited from these systems, even if we haven't realized it.
It's not easy to face those truths.
But it's necessary if we want to create real change.
And that's where Alexander's work is both challenging and inspiring. It forces us to look in the mirror.
But it also gives us hope. By pointing to these movements, like All of Us or None, that are showing us a different way forward.
These movements are led by the people who are most affected by these systems, and they're demanding real change. Not just inclusion, but a complete transformation.
And I think that's what's so important about Alexander's work. She's pushing us to think bigger, to move beyond these simple solutions, and to imagine a more radical and transformative vision of justice.
A vision that requires us to confront our own biases.
And our responsibility to create a better world.
Absolutely. And that message is so relevant today as we continue to see these struggles for racial justice unfolding all around us.
Which brings us to a really important part of Alexander's analysis, the role of Barack Obama's presidency.
Yeah, it's complicated, right? On the one hand, Obama's election was a historic moment, a symbol of progress and hope for so many people.
But Alexander also points out how his presidency might have actually reinforced some harmful ideas about race and progress.
Like the idea that electing a black president meant the end of racism, or that individual achievement somehow means we don't need systemic change.
Right.
Or even that criticizing Obama's policies was an attack on black people.
She also highlights some of the decisions that were made during his administration that actually made mass incarceration worse.
Like the continuation of the drug war and the
Yeah.
expansion of law enforcement programs that disproportionately target communities of color.
So even though his presidency was symbolically important, the systems of oppression were still in place.
Yeah, she's urging us to look deeper, to see that real progress requires more than just representation at the top.
It requires actually changing the systems.
Exactly.
It's not enough to have a black president if the policies he's putting in place are actually hurting black communities.
That's such an important point. It's a reminder that we have to stay engaged. We can't become complacent, even when it seems like things are getting better.
We have to keep pushing for real change.
Not just symbolic victories.
And that's where I think Alexander's work connects so well with Baldwin's.
They're both calling for a radical transformation of society.
And for recognition of our shared humanity.
And for a refusal to be complicit in the dehumanization of others.
It's about creating a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Absolutely. And that call to action is just as urgent today as it was when they wrote those words.
So where do we go from here? If colorblindness isn't the answer, what is?
Yeah, that's the big question. And, Alexander doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but she does offer this really interesting way of thinking about race and equality. She suggests that instead of trying to create a colorblind society, we should be striving for a society where we actually see each other.
That's a really important difference, isn't it? It's not about pretending that our differences don't exist. It's about acknowledging them and understanding why they matter.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that race does matter. It's shaped our history, and it continues to shape our present. But it's also about choosing to connect with each other on a deeper level, recognizing our shared humanity, even though we have these differences.
It's like that saying, I see your color, and I honor it.
Yeah.
It's not about pretending we're all the same. It's about acknowledging our differences
Yeah.
and choosing to move forward together.
Yeah, I love that. And Alexander argues that this is so important for actually dismantling these systems, because we can't fix what we refuse to see.
It's like trying to navigate a maze in the dark. You might stumble around for a while, but you're never going to find your way out until you turn on the light.
That's a great analogy. And that's really the challenge, isn't it? To turn on the light, to really see how race and racism are still operating in our society.
And once we see it, we can start to dismantle it,
One step at a time.
system by system.
Yeah,
But it all starts with seeing it, with acknowledging the reality.
absolutely.
And that takes courage, doesn't it? It takes a willingness to be uncomfortable, to challenge our own assumptions.
It's not easy work.
But it's the work that needs to be done.
It is.
And I think that's why Alexander's work is so powerful, because it connects with all these other voices who are calling for a more just and equitable world. People like James Baldwin, who challenged us to see the humanity in everyone, even those who are different from us, and movements like All of Us or None that are fighting for the rights of those who have been marginalized.
It's a reminder that this fight for racial justice, it's a fight for all of us. And the only way we're going to win it is by working together.
So for our listeners who are trying to make sense of all this, what can they do? How can they get involved?
Well, I think the first step is education. Reading books like The New Jim Crow, listening to podcasts like this one, having conversations about race and racism. The more we understand these issues, the better equipped we'll be to actually challenge them.
It's about being aware of our own biases
Yeah.
and being willing to challenge them
In ourselves?
and in others.
Yeah.
And it's about taking action, supporting organizations that are working for racial justice, speaking out against injustice, using our voices to advocate for change.
Right. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play.
It might feel overwhelming sometimes, but even small actions can make a difference.
They really can. Don't underestimate the power of your voice, your vote, your willingness to have those tough conversations. Change happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one action at a time.
Yeah, I love that. We've covered a lot today. And like you said, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. Alexander's book has so much in it, we could talk about it for hours. But I hope this deep dive has at least given everyone a sense of how important and urgent her message is.
I hope so too. And I hope it sparks some questions for people, and maybe even some uncomfortable conversations.
Because those are the conversations that we need to be having.
Ayar.
If we want to create real change. Change isn't easy, but it is possible. And as James Baldwin said, we can't be free until they are free.
So true.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a better world for all of us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
That's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for listening.